Pseudo-Legendary Pokemon are widely considered to be amongst the strongest in the entire game. But what if I told you that despite their stats being higher than almost every other Pokemon, including even many legendary Pokemon, they aren't actually all that good? At least, not anymore. So what caused these formerly dominant Pokemon like Tyranitar, Metagross, and Garchomp to fall off as much as they have? Well, first, what do I mean when I say they fell off? Considering these Pokemon's sky-high stats, I think the fact that there wasn't a single one within the top 12 most used Pokemon at the latest international championship, as well as there only being one player in the entire top 8 there even using a pseudo-legendary at all, constitutes a pretty big fall-off, especially compared to how dominant these Pokemon were in prior generations. But in order to evaluate that, we need to first look back at each of these pseudo-legendaries' competitive history. First up is Dragonite, the first ever pseudo-legendary. Now, I've already uploaded an entire video about Dragonite's complete competitive history, so I'll keep this section short. But basically, Dragonite has actually never been very good in the official competitive Pokemon circuit. It's always been outclassed by other dragon types, many of whom were pseudo-legendaries themselves, like Salamence and Garchomp. And it's just not really fair when you have to compete with Pokemon who share your type, have the same high stats that you do, but were released almost a decade later than Dragonite, which is more than enough time for Game Freak to cook up their next broken mistake. It wasn't until the release of Scarlet and Violet and the introduction of terastallization where Dragonite would no longer have to compete with other dragon types, and could instead become a normal type, firing off extremely powerful Terranormal boosted extreme speeds. This led to Dragonite becoming one of the most feared Pokemon in competitive play. But once we move to Generation 10, presumably without terastallization, it's pretty likely that Dragonite will just fall back into mediocrity, as it just hasn't been able to keep up with the more modern dragon types. The second ever pseudo-legendary, Tyranitar, has managed to stand the test of time much better than the others. This is in large part thanks to its ability, Sandstream, which creates a sandstorm weather effect for 5 turns after it hits the field. Weather effects in competitive Pokemon are incredibly powerful. Not only does Tyranitar itself benefit from the sandstorm due to its rock typing, gaining a 50% special defense boost for as long as the sandstorm is active, but allied Pokemon like Lycanroc and Excadrill can take huge advantage of it as well with their abilities, allowing them to attack before the opponent can even move. While Tyranitar was actually banned from official competitive play the first few years of the circuit's existence, it saw a ton of success right when it was first made legal in 2010. Despite having to compete amongst the restricted legendary Pokemon that year, its ability to disrupt the weather-based strategies led by Kyogre and Groudon allowed it to peak as high as a second place finish at the World Championship that same year. It also got second at Worlds in 2013 and 2014, but its best performance came in 2012, where it played a major role in helping me win my third World Championship. Ever since 2014 though, Tyranitar's success really started to diminish. It would never even reach the top 4 at the World Championships in the decades since. What exactly was the cause for this? Well, one reason is the introduction of Fairy types, which would prey on Tyranitar's Dark typing. Another is the gradual decline in Psychic type Pokemon. Psychics like Latios and Cresselia used to be absolutely dominant in competitive play, and Tyranitar was able to easily switch in on them, while hitting back for massive super effective damage. But as Psychic types became less and less common, the need for Tyranitar grew less and less. Tyranitar was also historically a great answer to have against Rain, Sun, and Hail-based teams, as you could disrupt their weather-reliant strategies. But coincidentally, starting with the release of X and Y in exactly 2014, Game Freak nerfed all of the weather-setting abilities, including Tyranitar's Sandstream. Up until Generation 5, these abilities would set the weather for the entire battle, or at least until the weather was changed. But ever since Generation 6, it was nerfed to only last 5 turns. This meant that not only were teams based around the sandstorm weather effect less powerful, but the other weather-based strategies suffered as well, which meant there was less of a need to rely on Tyranitar to counter them, when all you had to do was simply stall out the weather for 5 turns. To put it simply, Tyranitar used to be a great Pokemon that you could easily splash on any team and find success. Tyranitar was still a successful Pokemon over the following decade, with a handful of first place finishes at regional level events in 2015, 2018, 2020, and even in 2023 in Scarlet and Violet. But its usage and success have been in a steady decline, with it consistently falling between the 20th to 40th most used Pokemon throughout most of Scarlet and Violet. Bulky dark types like Assault Vest King Gambit and Ting Lu were simply able to offer a lot more to most teams. Generation 3, with the release of Ruby and Sapphire, brought us two new pseudo-legendaries, Salamence and Metagross. Let's talk about Salamence first. Going back to what I mentioned before, Salamence was a purely upgraded version of Dragonite. They had very similar stats, with Salamence being slightly faster and stronger, but it also had Intimidate, allowing it to lower the opponent's physical damage against not only Salamence, but the entire rest of its team. I've talked before on this channel about how Intimidate is one of the best abilities in all of competitive Pokemon, so it should come as no surprise to hear that Salamence was extremely dominant for a very long time. What might come as a surprise though is that despite its sky-high attack stat, it was actually used exclusively as a special attacker. There weren't any strong yet reliable physical dragon-type moves for double battles, while Draco Meteor was one of the strongest moves in the entire game. So even though Salamence had significantly lower special attack than attack, it could deal far more damage with Draco Meteor than it could with Dragon Claw. Salamence would go on to win the World Championships in 2009, but the release of a superior Intimidator that shared Salamence's same 4x weakness to Ice, Landorus Therian, would end up pushing Salamence to the wayside in all of the years Landorus was also available to be used. That is, until Game Freak turned him into a croissant. I can't emphasize enough how big this was for Salamence. Not only could it still support the team with Intimidate when it was initially sent out, but after Mega Evolving, it would become an enormous damage threat thanks to its new ability, Aerialate. Aerialate would not only turn all normal type moves into flying type ones, which effectively gave them a 50% damage boost since Salamence was also a flying type, but Aerialate also gave those normal turn flying type moves an additional 30% damage boost on top of that. And despite being nerfed to 20% a few years later, this broken ability, paired with Mega Salamence's extremely high speed stat and strong offensive stats, let it threaten full HP Pokemon with an incredibly powerful flying type Double Edge, or pick off weakened opponents with incredibly powerful spread damage in the form of flying type Hyper Voice. While regular Salamence still saw bits of success in 2014 and 2017, thanks to the limited regional dex formats preventing the use of Landorus Therian form, this new Mega Evolution allowed Salamence to go on and win 2 more World Championships in 2018 and 2019. Giving it a total of 3 World Championships, tied for the most ever. Unfortunately for Salamence, it would go on to struggle in both the Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet eras. While Salamence did have some solid showings in Scarlet and Violet as a Tailwind setter with Intimidate that can also punish Urshifu, thanks to its Dragon and Flying typing combined with the Rocky Helmet held item, there's no denying that it's been in a significant decline ever since it lost the ability to Mega Evolve, and has only been about the 50th most used Pokemon throughout all of Scarlet and Violet. Moving on to the second of the 2 Generation 3 Pseudo-Legendaries, Metagross, who is one of my personal favorite Pokemon since, well, there's a reason there was an actual official Rizzo Metagross event distribution, because like Tyranitar, it also helped me win my 3rd World Championship. And like Dragonite, I did an entire video on Metagross's complete competitive history as well. But to summarize it here, Metagross won 3 of the first 5 World Championships, and was at the time widely considered to be the best Pokemon in the entire game. A series of nerfs throughout the years really caused its usage to tank, but its new Mega Evolution in Generation 6 brought it back to competitive relevancy, allowing it to capture first place finishes at a number of regional and even national level events. However, the 4th Worlds title continued to elude it. Like Tyranitar, Metagross had a short stint in Sword and Shield, where it was able to take advantage of the weakness policy held item, combined with Dynamax to completely sweep unprepared teams. But it was never able to achieve any big tournament finishes, in part due to the worldwide pandemic that halted all in-person tournaments. Metagross hasn't had any notable success yet in Scarlet and Violet, though it's only been legal for a few months. But ever since winning its 3rd World Championship, Metagross has needed the ever-changing generational mechanics like Mega Evolution and Dynamax to remain top tier, so like the others, I think it's pretty safe to say that it's been in decline since its heyday in Generations 4 and 5. Speaking of Generation 4, the release of Diamond and Pearl brought us Garchomp, the 5th Pseudo-Legendary. Garchomp started off strong, winning multiple regional championships in 2008 and 2009. But it was never able to capture the World Championship title until Generation 5. Like Metagross and Tyranitar before it, Garchomp also played a major role on my 2012 Worlds winning team. Okay, maybe 18-year-old me thought pseudo-legendaries were just really cool. Anyway, Garchomp was the strongest ground-type attacker in the entire game, which was very significant because not only was ground a strong offensive type, but Earthquake, the strongest reliable ground-type move, hit all Pokemon on the field in double battles. This allowed Garchomp, with its high speed and attack stat, to dish out major damage when it was paired with Levitators and Flying-type allies, like Cresselia, Rotom, and Thundurus. Not only was Garchomp faster than Dragonite and Salamence while being just as strong as them, but it was also bulkier than them, thanks to its surprisingly high HP and defenses. This was pretty important because Garchomp was actually capable of surviving most Ice Beams and Hidden Power Ices from non-Ice type Pokemon. Sorry, Hidden Power Ice is basically Ice type Tera Blast for you Zoomers. But 2013, however, was pretty much the end for Garchomp because, you guessed it, Landorus Mistake Form was introduced into the game. Not only was Landorus an even stronger bulky ground-type attacker, but it also had Intimidate to help out the rest of its team. You know, I'm noticing a trend here, where Game Freak clones an existing powerful Pokemon, gives it Intimidate, power creeping the OG out of competitive relevance. But the introduction of Landorus Therian would effectively banish Garchomp to only limited regional dex formats, where Landorus wasn't allowed. To be fair, Garchomp would be really successful in those formats over the years, but even in the early months of Scarlet and Violet, before Landorus Therian became legal, Great Tusk, a new Paradox Pokemon that had lower total base stats than Garchomp, had even begun to power creep Garchomp as a strong ground-type attacker. If that isn't the perfect example of power creep, then I don't know what is. Generation 5 Pseudo-Legendary was Hydreigon, who, yet again, helped me win my 2012 World Championship. Yeah, I may have put a bunch of Pseudo-Legendaries on one team in order to win. But back to Hydreigon. What made it so good was its unique Dark and Dragon typing, combined with its high special attack. I mentioned before how there weren't really any great physical Dragon-type moves, to the point that even Salamence was used as a special attacker. Well, Hydreigon could fire off stronger Draco Meteors than all of the previous Dragon-type Pseudo-Legendaries, and it could also threaten most of the Trick Room setters, a very strong and common strategy in competitive Pokemon who are commonly Psychic or Ghost types. In fact, Hydreigon was so good that Game Freak had to introduce the Fairy type immediately after in Generation 6, which gave Hydreigon a brand new 4x weakness. Hydreigon managed to find success even despite the addition of Fairy types, but it would no longer be the top tier Pokemon it once was. While it was able to win multiple regional and national championships in the first year of Generation 6 tournaments in 2014, it actually wouldn't win a single major tournament ever again. Generation 6 didn't just bring us the new Fairy type, it also brought us another new Dragon-type Pseudo-Legendary, Goodra. Goodra, though, was unfortunately just a bad Pokemon. What Goodra did have going for it was its massive special defense, allowing it to actually take hits from special attacking Fairy types like Gardevoir, Sylveon, and Togekiss, but its low speed and mediocre special attack meant it just wasn't able to do much in return to opposing Pokemon, and was still outclassed by other Dragon types. Goodra's Hisuian form, on the other hand, is at least pretty decent, despite its lack of major tournament success, as it has a better typing, a clearly defined niche of Iron Defense plus Body Press, as well as an ability that prevents it from being critical hit, one of the main weaknesses of a defensive setup Pokemon and a great help against the ever-common Urshifu. Moving to Generation 7, Game Freak couldn't resist making another Dragon-type Pseudo-Legendary, this time giving us the first ever Dragon and Fighting-type Pokemon, Kommo-o. Kommo-o would actually have a decent amount of success in Generation 7, with a number of first place finishes at various regional championships throughout 2018. This success was in large part thanks to its signature Z move, Clangorous Soul Blaze, which was a massive 185 base power move that hit both opposing Pokemon, yet also boosted every single one of Kommo-o's stats by one stage. This move somehow made Xerneas' Geomancy look balanced. Unfortunately for Kommo-o, Z-moves would only exist in Generation 7, and it would see virtually no success in the following Generation 8. When Kommo-o was introduced into Scarlet and Violet via the DLC, it actually managed to win a regional championship pretty soon after, but it wasn't due to its signature moves Clangorous Soul and Clanging Scales. It was, just like I mentioned with Hisuian Goodra, an Iron Defense Body Press set, where it could take advantage of Terastallization to give itself a better defensive type, while retaining the 50% damage boost on body press thanks to its original fighting typing. Despite this lone regional championship victory in Generation 9, Komodo is achieving nowhere near the level of usage and success that it had back in Sun and Moon. And once we lose the ability to terrestrialize in future generations, its poor typing will likely hold it back from having much success, just like in Generation 8. Speaking of Generation 8, Game Freak yet again brought us a new Dragon-type Pseudo-Legendary, the Ghost Dragon-type Dragapult. Dragapult itself felt like a Pokemon that was power creeping others as it was given a massive 142 base speed stat. Dragapult was so incredibly fast that even Pokemon holding the Choice Scarf item struggled to outspeed it. Now, this would have been manageable if it wasn't also given a high attack stat combined with Metagross's Clear Body ability, preventing opponents from lowering its attack as counterplay, but Dragapult would absolutely dominate the early months of Sword and Shield, as it was one of the top 2 most used Pokemon in the entire game. It made a phenomenal Dynamax target, especially when holding the Weakness Policy item, as it could both dish out major damage that would only get stronger with each consecutive use of Max Phantasm, and it could support the team with Max Airstream, which boosted its allies' speed stat. Dragapult could also be used in a fully supportive role, instead activating an ally's weakness policy, burning opponents with Will-O-Wisp and setting up both Reflect and Light Screen to keep its partners alive longer. It was a very versatile Pokemon, and was able to win both of the first 2 Players' Cup tournaments, which were online tournaments Pokemon held due to the cancellation of in-person events during the pandemic. Dragapult's success continued into Scarlet and Violet, as it was able to win both a regional and international championship, and almost won the 2023 World Championship, where it finished runner-up. It's still early, so we can't really judge if it's going to be power crept, or if it's the one doing the power creep. Last up, we have Generation 9. Let's talk about Excalibur. Upon release, many players were actually writing it off, in large part due to its mediocre speed stat and horrible ice typing. But in Generation 9, ice types received a massive buff. The formerly known as Hail weather effect was reworked into the Snow weather effect, which would give all ice types a 50% boost to their defense when active, massively improving a Pokemon like Excalibur's survivability. On top of that, the new terrestrialization mechanic let it simply change its poor defensive type combination anytime it needed, with a massive 145 base attack stat backed up by an ability that prevents it from being burned, and in fact receives further boost to its attack anytime it's hit with a damaging fire-type move. Excalibur became a massive threat both in and out of snow-based teams. Like Dragapult, it's too early to judge how Excalibur stacks up against the competition, but the early results of both a regional and international championship victory in just 1 year are certainly very promising. Alright, this might spark some controversy, but I can't end the video here, because we have to talk about Archaludon. Western Pokemon fans are still debating whether it should be considered a pseudo-legendary or not, but in Japan, pseudo-legendaries are actually referred to as the 600 base stat total club, seeing as, well, they all uniquely have a base stat total of exactly 600, without being legendary Pokemon themselves. Archaludon fits this criteria, and so in Japan, it's actually lumped in with all of the other pseudo-legendary Pokemon. Archaludon has only been legal for a few months, and while it hasn't seen major success yet, it's certainly showing its potential. A Power Herb set utilizing its sturdy ability to prevent opponents from taking advantage of its low special defense to knock it out in one hit looks promising on Tailwind teams, where after an Electro Shot, it can start doing major damage. On the other hand, an Assault Vest set utilizing its Stamina ability is quite effective on Rain teams, where it doesn't need the Power Herb to fire off repeated Electro Shots, and the defense boost from Stamina plus the Assault Vest make it incredibly difficult to knock out. Overall, while there's no denying that pseudo-legendary Pokemon do still see play and have success, I hope I've been able to convey how stark the difference is to how much usage and success they used to have. Despite having stats that rival actual legendary Pokemon, these pseudo-legendaries are having less usage and success than even many regular non-legendary Pokemon. And outside of the ever-changing generational gimmicks and limited regional dex formats, they're rarely seen at the top of the usage charts any longer.